I was born and raised in a little town called Maplewood, Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life was simple. My dad was a mechanic, and my mom ran the only grocery store in town. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. Growing up, I was just like any other kid, curious, always exploring the woods near our house, getting into trouble here and there. But what really got me were the stories the old folks in town would tell. Ghost stories, mostly. Haunted houses, creatures in the woods, that sort of thing. I loved hearing them, but I never really believed in any of it. Fast forward a few years, and I'm in my early 20s, trying to figure out what to do with my life. There weren't many jobs in Maplewood, so I ended up taking a job as a security guard at St. Mary's Hospital in the city. It was a pretty old building, built way back in the early 1900s. The place had history, that's for sure. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and sometimes, late at night, you could hear strange noises echoing through the empty halls. I didn't pay much attention to it, though. I figured it was just the building settling, or maybe a rat scurrying around. My job was mostly uneventful. I worked the night shift, so it was pretty quiet. I'd make my rounds, check the doors, and make sure everything was locked up. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but it paid the bills. Most nights, I was alone in those long, dimly lit corridors. The place had a way of playing tricks on your mind. The shadows seemed to move when you weren't looking, and sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, but I always shrugged it off. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But then came that night, the night that changed everything. It was a cold, rainy night, one of those nights where the wind howls and the rain pelts against the windows like it's trying to get in. I was making my rounds just like any other night when I heard it. A faint noise is coming from one of the old, deserted wings of the hospital. The East Wing, if I remember right. That part of the building hadn't been used in years, not since they'd moved most of the patients to the newer section. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I got closer I realized it was something else. It sounded like footsteps, slow and dragging, like someone was shuffling across the floor. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was probably just a homeless person who'd somehow gotten inside. It wouldn't have been the first time. I followed the noise down the hallway, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and there was this smell like something rotten. When I turned the corner, I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back to me. She was wearing a hospital gown, the kind they give patients, but something was off. Her legs were all wrong. They were bent backward, twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I froze, my heart in my throat. For a moment I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was seeing things, but then she turned around. I'll never forget what I saw. Her eyes were black, completely black, like there was nothing there but darkness. And that smile was twisted, unnatural, like her face had been stretched into a grin. But the worst part was the way she moved. She didn't walk. She ran, her twisted legs carrying her toward me faster than anything human should be able to move. I didn't think I just turned and ran. I could hear her behind me, those awful twisted legs slapping against the floor. But the sound was wrong, like bones breaking with each step. The lights flickered above me as I ran, and I could feel her getting closer, her breath cold against my neck. I wanted to look back to see how close she was, but I knew if I did, I wouldn't make it out of there. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, my feet pounding against the tiles as I raced toward the main entrance. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let her catch me. Just as I reached the doors, I heard a scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the hallway. I don't know if it was her or me, but it was enough to push me through those doors and out into the cold night. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped, the lights stopped flickering, and the cold, oppressive feeling that had been pressing down on me vanished. I stood there gasping for breath, staring back at the hospital. She was gone, but I knew she was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. I quit the next morning. I told my boss I couldn't do it anymore, and I packed up and went back to Maplewood. I never told anyone what happened that night. Not really. I mean, who would believe me? But I can still feel her eyes on me, even now, like she's watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. I don't go back to the city much anymore, and I stay away from hospitals whenever I can. But every now and then, when the wind howls just right or when I'm alone at night, I think about her, about what I saw, and about how close I came to never making it out of that hospital. And I wonder if she's still there, haunting those halls, waiting for the next poor soul to come across her path. I'm Jack, and I've lived in this small town in the US my whole life. It's a quiet place, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and not much changes, but there's one place in town that everyone avoids, the old hospital on the outskirts. They say no one comes back from there, and I never believed it until I found out for myself. It started as a dare. My friends knew I was the skeptical type, never buying into the local ghost stories, so when they dared me to spend the night at the hospital, I couldn't refuse. It was just an old abandoned building. What could possibly go wrong? The hospital was a massive, crumbling structure, swallowed by vines and shadows. The windows were shattered, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing down the dark, empty corridors. I stepped inside, and immediately I felt like I'd made a mistake. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was a deep, unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. But I kept going, telling myself it was just nerves. As I walked through the halls, my flashlight flickering with each step, I noticed something odd. The walls seemed to be covered in strange symbols, like they were drawn in a hurry. The further I went, the more I noticed the symbols were smeared in what looked like blood. A sound echoed down the hall, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I frozen, shining my flashlight around, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, until I could make out the words, "Leave, before it finds you." My heart pounded as I turned to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispering became more frantic, more desperate, as if warning me of something. And then I saw a shadow at the end of the hall, moving towards me. It was tall and hunched, with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. I forced my legs to move, sprinting down the corridors, trying to find the exit, but the hospital seemed to twist and turn on itself, the hallways stretching endlessly. No matter which way I went, I couldn't find my way out. The whispering followed me, now mixed with low, guttural growls. The walls seemed to close in, and the cold was so intense that I could see my breath in the air. Panic set in, as I realized I was completely lost, trapped in this nightmarish maze. Then I heard the sound of something dragging across the floor, getting closer. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence looming behind me. The air grew thicker, the whispers turning into screams. I finally stumbled into a room, slamming the door behind me. The room was pitch black, but I could hear something breathing heavily in the corner. My flashlight flickered back to life, revealing the source of the sound. A figure crouched in the corner, its face hidden in the shadows. Before I could react, it lunged at me, knocking the flashlight out of my hand. I scrambled to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was on me in seconds. its icy hands wrapping around my throat, squeezing the life out of me. As I gasped for air, I heard the whispers again, this time right in my ear. "You should have left." Everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up I was outside the hospital, lying in the overgrown grass. The sun was just rising, and the building looked as decrepit as ever. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The whispers, the shadows, the thing that tried to kill me, they were all real. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I was plagued by nightmare visions of that shadowy figure, the suffocating darkness, and the relentless whispers that warned me of dangers I couldn't see. But the worst part was the sickness that followed. It started with a fever, one that no amount of rest or medication could break. My parents grew worried as I became weaker, barely able to get out of bed. The doctors in town couldn't figure out what was wrong. I was admitted to the local hospital, where they ran test after test, but nothing came up. They said it was like my body was shutting down, as if I were being drained of life itself. My skin was pale, my eyes hollow, and every breath felt like a struggle. I spent weeks in that hospital, growing weaker by the day. My parents were beside themselves with worry, and the doctors were baffled. There was talk of moving me to a larger hospital in the city, but before they could, something strange happened. One night, as I lay in that sterile hospital room, I heard the whispers again. They were faint, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You need to leave, it's not safe." I tried to call out for the nurse, but my voice was too weak. The room grew colder, the air thick with the same unnatural chill I'd felt in that cursed hospital. I was terrified, convinced that whatever had haunted me there had followed me, and now it was coming to finish the job. But then, just as quickly as the whispers started, they stopped. The coldness faded, and I could breathe again. The next morning, the doctors were stunned to find that my fever had broken. Over the next few days, I began to recover, gaining strength little by little. My parents didn't waste any time. As soon as I was well enough, they made the decision to leave our small town and move to Chicago. They never told me exactly why, but I think they knew something wasn't right in that town, especially after what happened to me. We've been in Chicago for a few years now, and life is much better. The city is bustling, full of life, and the memories of that night have started to fade. I'm healthier than I've ever been, and I've even managed to make new friends. But every now and then, I still get that feeling, the sense that something is watching me, waiting. I try to push those thoughts away and tell myself it's all in the past. But deep down, I know that night at the hospital will haunt me for the rest of my life, no matter how good things are now. I'll never forget the horror of that place, the way it reached out and almost took me. Some nights, when it's quiet, I think I can still hear the whispers, and even though I'm far away from that old hospital, I can't shake the feeling that it's not done with me yet. Dr. Evelyn Reed had heard the rumors, but she dismissed them as nonsense. She was a woman of science, not superstition. The stories about Ward 13 were just that, stories. Still, the atmosphere at St. Augustine's Hospital had changed since the ward reopened. Something lingered in the air, a heaviness that made the night shifts unbearable. It was a stormy night when Evelyn was assigned to the graveyard shift on Ward 13. The ward had been closed for years due to a fire that claimed the lives of several patients and a nurse. The room had since been refurbished, but no one wanted to work there. The patients assigned to Ward 13 were the ones who had no other place to go: the comatose, the terminally ill, and the forgotten. Evelyn entered the ward just before midnight. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as rain pounded against the glass. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a cold, sterile light over the rows of beds. Only a handful of patients occupied the ward, their weak breaths the only sign of life. She began her rounds, checking vitals and adjusting medication drips. The patients were unresponsive as usual. It should have been a routine night, but something felt off. The air was thick, with a sense of dread, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she reached the last bed in the row, she paused. The patient, an elderly man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, stared at the ceiling. His file said he was in a deep coma, yet his eyes were open, unblinking. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She reached for his hand, checking for a pulse. It was faint but steady. Still, something about his gaze unnerved her. His eyes seemed to follow her every movement, though he didn't move a muscle. She shook off the unease and continued her rounds, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every shadow seemed to move, and every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing. As the hours passed, the room grew colder and the lights dimmer. At 3 a.m., the hospital's emergency generator kicked in, casting the ward into darkness for a brief moment before the backup lights flickered on. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She turned to check on the patients, but something was wrong. The elderly man who had been staring at the ceiling was now sitting up in bed, his eyes fixed on her. His mouth moved, forming silent words. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. He was supposed to be in a coma. She took a step back, her pulse quickening. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man's mouth continued to move, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, he raised a trembling hand and pointed to the corner of the room. Evelyn's gaze followed his finger, and her blood ran cold. In the far corner of the ward, shrouded in darkness, stood a figure. It was a woman, her features obscured by shadows. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her hair hung limply over her face. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the woman took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" Evelyn gasped, backing away. The woman didn't answer. She moved closer, and as she did, the lights flickered again. For a split second, Evelyn saw her face, a grotesque, burned visage with empty eye sockets and a twisted grin. Evelyn screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't blink. She pounded on it, her screams echoing through the empty halls of the hospital. She turned to face the ward, and the woman was gone. The elderly man had collapsed back onto the bed, his eyes closed once more. Panicking, Evelyn fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. The only sound in the room was the steady beeping of the heart monitors. She rushed to the nurse's station, desperate to call for help, but the phone lines were down. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. It came from behind her, close to her ear. She spun around, but no one was there. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. "Get out," they hissed. "You don't belong here." Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her head. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in on her. She ran back to the door, her hands shaking as she tried to pry it open. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a deafening roar. And then, silence. The door swung open, and Evelyn fell into the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of the main wing of the hospital. Gasping for breath, she looked back, expecting to see the burned woman following her. But the hallway was empty, the door to Ward 13 ajar. Evelyn didn't return to Ward 13 that night, or ever again. The next day, she requested a transfer to a different hospital, far from St. Augustine's. She never spoke of what happened, but the memory haunted her every night. A week later, news broke that a nurse had gone missing during her shift on Ward 13. The security footage showed her walking into the ward at midnight, but she never came out. The only clue was a single blood-stained handprint on the door and the faint scent of burning flesh lingering in the air. Ward 13 was sealed off permanently after that, but the stories persisted. The staff whispered about the burned woman and the patients who never truly died. They said if you listened closely, you could still hear the whispers late at night, warning anyone foolish enough to enter the silent